My name's Danielle Rebecki, and I'll be the moderator for this session. So before we start, I'd like to request that everybody make sure their microphones are on mute. That'll help us get rid of some of that background noise that's happening. Cool. So if you have any technical problems throughout the presentation, just let me know by typing into the question section in the right-hand sidebar. If you lose your connection, we've found generally that closing your browser and restarting it should solve most problems. And yeah, just ensure you remain muted throughout the presentation until we get to the discussion part at the end of the webinar. So this session will finish at around 5 p.m, so we'll go for approximately 1 hour. We will make a recording and this will be available on the ITE ANZ website within a few days. So if you have questions, comments, etc., as we go, just either make a note to yourself or raise via the right-hand sidebar, via the chat, and we'll address them in the questions part of the webinar. And if it's relevant, also just put down the slide number that your question refers to. So in today's presentation, we'll probably have questions at around the midway point and then again at the end. Okay, so I'd like to introduce David Nash, who will be speaking today. David is Principal of Trafinity, Traffic Engineering Consultancy, and he is Secretary of the ITE ANZ. He has 40 years experience in traffic engineering, having spent most of his career working at VicRoads. David has lectured in transport engineering at Swinburne University and has conducted many workshops and webinars around Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. So today, David's going to discuss the concept of induced transport demand and how this affects the understanding of transport planning and project evaluation. He will offer critical commentary on some post-truth slogans that pepper the public perception of transport issues. So I'll hand it over to David.
Great, thank you very much for that, Danielle. So I've been reading up a bit recently about induced demand, and some of what I've read has been informative and some of what I've read has been a little bit disturbing. So I thought it was a good idea to try to get a better handle on what we actually mean by induced demand. So the subtitle is, do we get it? And that, of course, is an ambiguous question. The answer to the question, do we experience it, is definitely yes. And the answer to the question, do we understand it, is I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are experts within transport planning and probably understand it quite well. But nevertheless, I think there's a bit of improvement. So I've been reading up on transport demand, and there's quite a lot that's written out there, and there's quite a few concepts that are given names. And it just seems to me that academics and researchers quite like to have a slogan with their name in front of it. So it seems to be a bit of a status symbol, but sometimes these slogans get misused. And while I will go through some of those slogans and explain what they mean, but others I'll leave to you to go to Wikipedia to look up. The Nash equilibrium, of course, is a very important concept, but as far as I'm aware, it's no relation to me. So what do we mean by induced demand? The word induced basically means caused. So we're looking at the cause of extra demand. And in the transport field, what we're talking about is that when transport infrastructure is improved, travel demand may be induced. In other words, there is more travel, more trips, and perhaps even longer trips. So in transport engineering terminology, we would call that VKT, vehicle kilometres travelled, actually increases as there's more travel demand. Economists like to explain that in terms of utility or generalised cost. So if we improve the infrastructure, we're improving things for the people who use it. And this improvement leads to an increase in demand for that service. Economists also explain this in terms of the supply and demand curves. These are probably curves and graphs that you've seen before in terms of economic activity. And if you increase the supply of something, then you're going to increase the demand of it at the same time. So the price and the quantity of the product will change according to these sorts of curves. The question is, does it really apply to travel? It certainly applies to travel in some ways, but in other ways, maybe it's not quite the same as products that people are after. I think one of the differences is that travel is more a means to an end rather than something that you want more of. You want probably less travel and more experience at the end of the travel trip rather than travel itself. And that's a bit different to consumable products. To understand induced demand, I think it's important to understand the concept of suppressed demand. So suppressed demand are discretionary trips that are not made due to unacceptable travel conditions. So traffic congestion or crowded trains means that the value of the trip to the person is less than the actual cost of the travel. So these are decisions that people are making every day. There are certain trips which are essential trips, like trips to work, apart from now in the coronavirus era. Mostly the trip to work or the trip to school is a trip that you have to make. You don't have too much choice over it, but there are other trips which are discretionary trips, and you might decide not to make those trips or to make fewer of those types of trips if the cost of travel, which includes the travel time, is too much. In congested cities, I think there is plenty of suppressed demand during the peak periods. In cities like Auckland and Melbourne and Sydney and the other major cities around Australia, there's certainly plenty of suppressed demand. And I quite like the explanation given in one of the papers that I read about induced demand actually being the relief of suppressed demand. That commentator actually said that induced demand is a myth, which I disagree with. I think induced demand is a real thing. But I think a good way of understanding it is to say that it is the relief of suppressed demand. So let's think a bit more about how travellers actually respond to major changes to the transport network, to the transport services. And these have to be major changes, things that are large enough that people will actually perceive the difference. And what will people do if there's an improvement to the transport service? They'll reroute from other routes to this route. They might retime from other times of the day to the peak times. And they might remode, in other words, change which mode of transport they're using. And in those three cases, it's the same trip. It's the same trip from the same origin to the same destination. You just might take a different route or do it at a different time of the day or use a different mode of transport. Then the fourth effect is relocation of trip ends. So you might relocate your home or your work or where you go to shop or where you go to for your social activities to make use of the improved transport service to take a trip which is a longer distance. So you're actually taking a longer distance trip, thus there is more travel. And that is part of induced demand. And then the fifth effect is making trips that were previously suppressed. So this also is induced demand, actually additional trips compared to what there was before the transport service was improved. It's important to recognise that this also works in the other direction, that if you degrade transport services and make them worse for the people using them in some way, it might be additional out-of-pocket cost or it might be additional travel time. What does it do? It will cause the travellers to do the same as before, but in the opposite direction, so reroute to other routes, retime to another time of day when there's less congestion or less crowding, remode to another mode of transport, or relocate a trip end to make a shorter trip distance, or reduce the number of trips, which is basically suppressing the demand. And then I've added in the sixth one, just for the sake of completeness, stick with it. Like if you degrade transport services, there'll be some people that will still use those services in the same way that they did before for trips that they need to make. They might need to leave earlier or arrive later using the same route, but they're going to still make that trip and make it the same time of day in order to get to work on time or whatever it might be. So when you degrade transport services, often there's a strategy of transport travel demand management, and the redoing things, the rerouting, retiming, remoding, relocating and reducing, often words that we use in order to encourage people to think about their travel if transport services are going to be degraded either permanently. And an example of that would have been in 1992 when Swanston Street was converted to Swanston Walk, or it might be short-term things like the Commonwealth Games in the Gold Coast in 2018, where this concept of rerouting, retiming, remoding, relocating and reducing was actually used within the travel demand management strategy and communications to people. Relocation is probably not such an important concept when you're talking about short-term events like the Commonwealth Games. The first three items up there, the rerouting, retiming and remoding, which are just redoing the same trips, is often called the theory of triple convergence. And here's one of the examples where some concept has got a nice researcher's name against it because he wrote a book about it. So this is additional travel that happens because you've improved the transport services, and it's usually in relation to road projects. You open a new road, then there will be this triple convergence of people onto that route. My problem is that sometimes this triple convergence gets confused with the induced demand, but they are different things, and I think it's important to keep that distinction between them. Induced demand also occurs not just with road projects, but with public transport projects. It's the same concept applies either way. So if you improve train, tram or bus services, that will result in some induced trips. And if you degrade the train, tram or bus services, it will result in some suppressed trips. But certainly the concept of induced demand is considered more when you're talking about road projects. So I just want to examine in a little bit more detail the effects that occur when you improve road infrastructure and the result of the improvement to the traveller. What are they going to do? First, rerouting car trips. So as you would expect, if you open a new road, then people from the adjacent parallel roads will relocate to the new road and thus experience reduced travel time and cost of travel. And if they're rerouting to a freeway, probably freeways are safer than most arterial roads, so there's also probably a safety benefit. So you've improved, in the case of the diagram on the right there, you've improved road A, as you would expect. But in improving road A, that means that some people might relocate from road B to road A, and then that might have a cascading effect throughout the network. So the benefits to traffic across the network can be quite widely spread. And also, and this is possibly something that is overlooked a bit, is that if you improve or reduce the amount of traffic on, in this case, a north-south road, the traffic signal system, we operate under SCATs in most places around Australia and New Zealand, it will readjust the green times for the competing movements at the intersection, so there will also be a benefit to the cross traffic as well and the turning traffic at the intersection. So the benefits again can be spread more widely, not just to north-south traffic, but also to east-west traffic across the whole area. And all of that has got to got to result in reduced fuel consumption and emissions, improved freight efficiency and productivity across a fairly wide area. But as we've discussed, that's not the only effect of improving road infrastructure. We can have retimed trips. So if congestion levels reduce in the peak periods, we can expect that some trips will be retimed from the off-peak periods to peak periods. There are benefits to the traveller. If there wasn't a benefit to the traveller, they wouldn't retime their trip, presumably. So the trip is taken at a more convenient time, even if the travel time and the cost of travel to that person remains much the same as it did before. And there's got to be a convenience factor there. And for freight trips, the more flexibility freight operators have for when they drive their trucks around the network, that's got to be a benefit for freight productivity and efficiency as well. However, fuel consumption and emissions might increase marginally because the effect of the retimed trips on other traffic will be higher during the peak period than it was during the off-peak period. This adds to the traffic demand in the peak period, but is offset somewhat by a reduction in the traffic demand during the off-peak period. So the net effect of retimed car trips is a benefit to those people who retime, but probably not a benefit overall in terms of sustainable transport. Remoded trips to cars. So if you improve road infrastructure, some people might decide to take the car rather than take their public transport or bicycle. That's got to be a benefit to the traveller who is remoted. Otherwise, why would they do it? This will result in an increase in fuel consumption and emissions and is contrary to the general sustainable transport strategy, which aims to reduce carbon emissions. How much remoted trips there are will depend very much on the project and how much public transport service there is in the nearby corridors. So that's something that transport planners hopefully will come to terms with and try to make estimates about. Then there's relocation. So we're talking here about relocating the trip ends. During peak periods, we're mostly talking about commuter trips between home, work and home and school. If people decide to relocate their home or relocate their work or change schools for whatever lifestyle or cost of living reasons it might be, there's more of an incentive for them to do that if the travel time has reduced. There's some evidence in the literature that people's travel time per day is reasonably constant, that over time, if you degrade travel time, then people will move closer to their work or school, and in the opposite direction, if you improve travel time, people might move further away. But those relocations are going to be longer term effects because there are so many other factors that affect a decision to relocate. Access to work and access to schools, access to family and friends. Households don't necessarily just consist of one person going off to work. There might be other members of the household who also work in different locations. And if you've got kids at home, then where the kids go to school will be an important decision. And of course, there's a major barrier to moving house called stamp duty. And you need to find availability of alternative affordable residential property to live in if you're going to move house, and moving work is also not necessarily that easy. So I think land use planning people would probably say that there is this relocation effect of improving road infrastructure, but it's more likely to be a longer term effect. It might be mitigated somewhat by land use planning policies. And there are other types of trips which might become longer trips, such as shopping trips or social trips. Instead of going to the closest shopping centre, you might decide to go to a shopping centre a bit further away, and those effects are more likely to be shorter term. but they would tend to be more in the off-peak periods. So, in summary of all of those different effects, I think we can define induced demand as when urban transport infrastructure is improved, travel demand can be induced, which is some of the suppressed demand being converted into actual trips as a direct result of the improvement. And there can also be longer trips due to this relocation effect. I think it's important that planners' frame of reference should be the whole transport system, not just one particular mode of transport. And therefore, it's important to define induced demand not only for what it is, but what it isn't. And it shouldn't include additional trips due to population expansion. It shouldn't include rerouted trips nor retimed trips. And if your frame of reference is the whole transport system, then it shouldn't include remoded trips either, but that does depend on what your frame of reference is. It's also important to recognise that these effects come about because of individual people's transport travel decisions, and they're responding to perceived changes, which might be a bit different from the real changes in traffic performance, for instance. And it's not necessarily going to lead to a perfect optimization or equilibrium solution. And some of the concepts that I put on one of the first slides, the Bray's paradox and various other things, and the Nash equilibrium as well, Mr. Nash was very important, indicate that a perfect social optimization might not be achieved by those things, but transport planners have got to make some assumptions about these things. One of the other people who managed to get their name in front of a concept was Mr. Jevons, the Jevons paradox, and Wikipedia separates this Jevons effect into an effect and a paradox. So the effect is that improving the efficiency of using a resource makes it cheaper, which encourages greater consumption. And the Jevons paradox is an extension of that to say that when the net effect of the additional consumption exceeds the efficiency gain, so that overall the community is using more of the resource. Jevons' work, which came from 1865, I think, so it's a long time ago, was working in relation to coal in the UK. So it's usually talked about in terms of energy efficiency and energy consumption. And it might lead to questions like, do solar panels encourage greater usage of energy? But the more important question for us is, how does the Jevons paradox play out in terms of transport? Is it the same as other consumables? So we might just stop there, having gone through a bit of discussion about how travellers respond to improvements and degradation of transport infrastructure and what the concept of induced demand is. I might sort of hand it over to Danielle to see whether there's any particular questions or comments that have come through that might be worth talking about.
Thanks, David. We have a couple of questions here. So the first one from Ben. Where do you believe real-time information fits in the discussion of induced demand? Does RTI disperse the induced demand as a result of differing perceptions and travel needs?
Good point, Ben. I think it does. As I pointed out, people's travel decisions does depend on their perceptions about what is happening, or the information that they're being fed from real-time information systems. So does it disperse the induced demand? It might affect the amount of induced demand. Whether it disperses it, I'm not quite sure. Any other comments there?
If anyone has a comment, feel free to unmute your mic and speak up. If not, we can move on to the next question. Okay. Okay, we'll move on to the next question for a moment. Or do you want to say something else, David?
All right, just reading through some of the comments there. Frank has said can also apply to non-urban travel. High-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne will result in induced demand. This extra travel may not be viewed as suppressed. Yep, that's probably a good point. Ross has asked the question, how well do existing strategic transport models deal with induced demand? And my answer to that is, I've got no idea. I'm hoping other people on this forum might have a better idea about the existing strategic transport models than I do. My main point is to try and make sure we have a common understanding of the concept of induced demand. Tom has made the point that as a modeller, he disagrees with the changes in destination being considered as induced demand. It's part of our strategic and metropolitan models. It is understood and allowed for in infrastructure business cases. It's all about where you set the boundaries. Yep, that's fair. And Mark Davies says that strategic models can account for reduced demand. I think the challenge for our profession is working out what is the elasticity of demand for transport projects, and I think it will be quite different for different projects in different parts of urban areas, and also how much remoding there might be between public transport and private transport. Nick wants to know whether there will be some decrease in travel as a result of the coronavirus. I think the answer is definitely yes. The question, he's called it disappearing demand. I think the question is, what are the longer term effects of this period of time going to be? Okay, Blake's asked a question about evaluation of projects, which I'll get onto in a minute. So we might just continue on from here. What I want to discuss now is how this relates to some of the conversation that we have both within the profession and even more importantly with the community as a whole. And one of the slogans that I've seen quite often expressed this way or in different ways is build a freeway and it just fills up. Let's just analyse that sentence in a little bit more detail. What do we mean by building a freeway? And we probably mean an urban freeway. There can be some rural situations where a freeway might fill up, but it's mostly an urban thing. And what do we mean by fills up? I think the traffic engineering interpretation of fills up means that it reaches capacity in the peak periods, causing flow breakdown and slow speeds, which is a concept that managed motorway practitioners well understand. What about the word and? Build a freeway and it just fills up. That sort of implies that it happens immediately, whereas it may or may not. For an inner urban freeway, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it doesn't reach capacity in the peak periods after, a few days or weeks. But outer urban freeways might take a while to reach peak period capacity. And the word just is probably the word I object to most in that sentence. That implies that filling up is the only relevant effect, which of course it isn't. There are many other effects of building a freeway. One of them is people relocating, rerouting their trips and the network benefits that get spread as a result of that. So there is induced demand, but that sentence doesn't quite capture the concept of induced demand. Build it and they will come is another catchphrase that is often used that means much the same thing. Now, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that these sorts of slogans, build a freeway and it just fills up, and build it and they will come, are sort of in the same category as a lot of other post-truth slogans. Maybe I'm going a bit too far in comparing them to stop the votes, axe the tax, and make America great again. But they have a similar implication to the public that might hear them because they are simplistic and popularist. And particularly they appeal to the selfish individual, because if you think about it in terms of the effect on a person who might travel on a particular road from home to work every day, and there's going to be a freeway built parallel to that road, and that's going to reduce their travel time by quite a lot, they would have thought. And then they read the newspaper articles and hear professionals saying, oh, build a freeway and it just fills up. Well, if it fills up, then my travel time is probably going to revert to what it was before, and therefore it really wasn't worth the government spending good taxpayer money building this freeway, because I'm going to be just as badly off after it fills up as I am now. And of course, that ignores what my travel time would be if the government did nothing. And it also ignores the benefit from reduced travel times over the next X years or X months or however long it takes until it does fill up. Of course, those statements do have a grain of truth to them, which is the concept of induced demand, if you don't think about it too hard. Here's a few other quotes from transport professionals. Expanding roads would only encourage more people to drive. Well, I think we've discussed from the concept of induced demand that expanding roads will result in some induced demand. So that will encourage more people to take more trips and to drive maybe longer trips. But it's not the only effect of those improvements. Increasing road capacity increases congestion. We don't have to look in theory. We don't have to be academic about this. Go and have a look at the Monash Freeway. Was a comment made in 2013, just after the Monash Freeway was expanded from 3 lanes to 4 lanes along most of its length. And you don't have to be academic about this. You do need to go and have a look. And the Monash Freeway was certainly a lot better off after expanding from 3 lanes to 4 lanes than it was before. There may have been increased congestion since then, but how much of that is due to induced demand and how much of that is due to increase in population is a bigger question we need to ask. So I'll come back to this. Increasing road capacity increases congestion in a few slides' time. Victorian governments have long failed to understand that bigger, better roads would inevitably lead to more people driving more often and further. I think we've established that if you improve roads, there will be some induced demand, so people will drive more often and further. The question is, how much of an effect is that? And have Victorian governments failed to understand the concept of induced demand? Well, if they have failed to understand it, then maybe it's a fault of the profession. Maybe we within the profession need to understand this concept better and make sure that it's communicated well to the politicians. This would eventually require more improvements to freeways as they struggle to cope with ever-increasing traffic. Well, they might be struggling to increase with ever-increasing traffic if you do nothing as well. Peninsular Link will inevitably lead to more congestion. I'll talk about Peninsular Link in a couple of slides' time, but I think that's demonstrably untrue. There's been much less congestion on Peninsular Link and in that corridor compared to before it was built. Melbourne became caught in a perpetual loop of induced demand. I'm not really sure what a perpetual loop of induced demand is, but just because you have some induced demand doesn't mean to say you get into a perpetual loop of encouraging more induced demand. I'm not really sure what that one is trying to say. And here's some other quotes from other non-transport professionals, but public transport advocates and other commentators. Building more roads doesn't help. Building roads actually makes things worse. Well, that all depends on what things you are trying to achieve. But if you're trying to achieve better transport, then building roads will certainly help. Improving public transport might help more, but building roads doesn't make things worse. Traffic grows to fill the available road space. Well, there is a concept of induced demand and there will be increased travel, but will it fill the available road space? How long will it take to fill the available road space? Build a road and vehicles will come in even greater numbers. Well, we've established that if you improve a road, then you'll probably get some induced demand, which is more numbers than you had before. But will the overall traffic performance get worse? Maybe it will take some time to achieve that. Some other headlines. This is an old one from when East-West Link was still a possibility. Tollway to hit peak capacity by 2031. So how can we translate that into transport planning terminology? I think what it's really saying, and what the person quoted in the article said, is that forecast AM peak traffic volumes on the tollway are predicted to reach capacity by 2031. So it was only really talking about the AM peak rather than the off-peak conditions. And is this a yardstick of project benefits? I would say no. So what are the fallacies in those statements? Firstly, hitting capacity in a future year in peak periods is not a disaster. After all, most existing freeways and arterial roads are already at capacity in the peak periods. Peak periods are only part of the day. What about the other 22 hours of the day which aren't quite so peakish? The evaluation should compare service levels in a future year with and without the project. So you have to compare the do-nothing scenario, particularly in a place like Melbourne. The population is expanding quite quickly. So how does the do-nothing option compare with the improving the infrastructure option? And there's another small fallacy, maybe just a little bit overlooked, which is that freeway congestion can be mitigated by managed motorway techniques. That is ramp metering. So if we control our freeways and motorways better by coordinated ramp metering systems, then we can actually prevent flow breakdown on the main line of the freeway, even if that means that there are longer delays on the entry ramps. So we can actually maintain travel speeds at a reasonable level, even if demand exceeds the capacity of the freeway. Does induced demand increase congestion? This is probably the key question arising from some of those statements that we saw in the newspapers and the other literature. My point is that there's no reason for induced demand to continue once the service levels return to the base levels. Once that occurs, discretionary trips will be suppressed again if everything else is equal. Why would people decide to make trips that they decided were not worth making before at a certain service level, if that service level gets back to the same level again? So improving travel service will not induce demand to the extent that it will increase congestion levels. I think increasing road capacity increases congestion, which is a statement I've seen in a few places, is illogical. Doing nothing in the face of population growth will increase congestion. So I think the Jevons paradox is a furphy in relation to transport. I think the Jevons effect, which is that there is some induced demand, is a real effect and something we need to take into account, but it won't increase congestion beyond where the congestion levels were before. I've tried to explain this concept diagrammatically in this very crude diagram. Consider that you have a starting point where the travel time is 60 minutes with a lot of congestion along a particular route. Then you open a new road or a new project which relieves that congestion, and the travel time reduces to 30 minutes. And that's probably a bit of a theoretical travel time improvement, because that would be the new road without any traffic on it. Then, of course, people will take advantage of the new infrastructure and reroute their travel around the road network to make use of the new infrastructure. And as we discussed before, that can have cascading effects across the network as a whole, and thus the travel time will creep back up to higher levels. There will be some retiming and remoding. I've sort of indicated this with the horizontal axis being a time axis, but of course a lot of these things are happening at the same time. And then, of course, there'll be some induced demand. But my point is that if the travel time gets back to 60 minutes again, why would anyone be taking additional trips above and beyond the 60-minute travel time that they experienced before? And that, of course, is on the assumption of everything else being equal and no population growth. This graph is probably even more crude than the previous one, trying to indicate how this might play out if there is continuing increase in demand because of growing population. So if you do nothing, the travel times will continue to increase, and I've shown a linear increase, but actually travel time and demand are not linearly related. They're probably more likely to be exponentially related. But for simplicity, I've just sort of drawn a straight line there. You'll get rerouting, retiming, remoding, and you'll get some induced demand. But once again, once you reach this level, the same level that you were at before, why would people be making more trips? Or maybe they'll be making more trips because with increasing population and increasing congestion levels generally, people are accepting the fact that their travel times will continue to grow. But eventually there's going to be some suppressed demand as well, as people decide that the congestion levels are too much for them to bear. The Peninsula Link. Peninsula Link, I think, is an example of a freeway project which has not increased any congestion. It opened in January 2013. It hasn't filled up yet, except maybe for a few hours on a Friday evening or a Sunday evening during summer when there's a bit of a recreational peak and there can be some flow breakdown on Peninsula Link. This is ignoring incidents like crashes, for instance. So it only really reaches capacity for a few hours per year, but the congestion on the Murdoch Highway and the Frankston Freeway is certainly reduced compared to what it was before. Now, that might not be a typical example because it's sort of outer urban, and it's certainly the same situation would not occur if we build East-West Link or if we build the North-East Link in Melbourne. But it only takes one case to disprove a theory, so that's my case. And I'd be interested in other people's comments about this. Is induced demand a cost or a benefit? I quite like David Levinson's statement within his book, Elements of Access, where he says you may say that the investment was in vain. So he's talking about here improving road infrastructure and having some induced demand, and the result is that congestion levels get back to close to where they were before. So he's saying you may say the investment was in vain. When you look only at the time use or the motorway speeds, you can essentially make the political argument that all investment is pointless. On the other hand, you could look at to see whether these long-term changes are indicators that more people can now use the capacity to do things that they want to do, when, where, and how they want to do them. So I'm not quite sure how transport economists take this into account, but I'd be interested in other people's comments. This is the way I understand transport economics works in the case of induced demand. So if you have a graph like this where the vertical axis is the cost of travel, which includes the cost of travel time, and the horizontal axis is the number of trips, then you're at an existing point here. Then you improve the infrastructure, and that reduces the cost of travel. It improves the travel time, so the cost of travel reduces considerably. If you assume that the number of trips remains the same, then the blue area is the economic benefit of that improvement to the community as a whole. However, that ignores induced demand. So as a result of the induced demand, depending on the shape of the elasticity of demand curve, which I've just shown diagrammatically here, there will be some additional trips. Those additional trips will degrade the service somewhat. So therefore, you'll come back to some equilibrium point where there are slightly fewer trips and slightly increased cost compared to the original assumption. So then the benefit of the project is actually the orange area, because the cost of travel has increased a bit, but there is slightly more people making the trip than there were before. And the transport economists talk about the rule of halves, which is taking into account the half of the benefit of the induced demand, which is this triangular area here as being the economic benefit of the induced demand. So that's a graph that was sketched for me literally on the back of an envelope, and I think explains to some extent how transport economists take induced demand into account. So how should we evaluate large projects? We need to include rerouting, and that can be over quite a large network area. We should include retiming and any remoting of trips, and we should include our estimates of induced demand. However, I think it's unrealistic to do that sort of evaluation of smaller projects where the benefit to travellers might be just marginal. I think the traditional evaluation of benefits is probably still reasonable to do. Assume the demand volumes are identical before and after, constrain the evaluation to just the relevant intersection or route, ignore rerouting, retiming and remoting, and ignore induced demand. There will be some effects, particularly there will be some rerouting, but it does seem to make it a lot easier if we just evaluate these smaller projects in a more simplistic and therefore consistent way. So people like to get their name in front of a concept of some sort. So I thought I'd try and get my name in front of the concept of a Nash synergy. Improving all urban transport modes improves the safety, efficiency, productivity and sustainability of the transport system as a whole. If we can improve all modes of transport, then that will benefit the community. Let's try to aim for projects that improve transport for one mode without adversely affecting other modes. Railway level crossings is a very good example of that, where we're improving things for the trains as well as for all the vehicles that are travelling on the road system, including buses and bicycles, and improving safety at the same time. So, in conclusion, let's adopt a common understanding of what induced demand is. It's additional travel caused by an improvement to a transport service. It consists of additional trips and some longer trips, and it can be seen as a relief of some of the suppressed demand. And let's define induced demand as also what it doesn't include, which it doesn't include additional trips due to population expansion. It doesn't include rerouted or retimed trips. And if your frame of reference is the whole transport system, then it doesn't include remoted trips as well. But if your frame of reference is just the road system, then certainly remoted trips is important. A few other conclusions. Congestion busting is a myth. A lot of politicians are using this term, congestion busting project. I don't think there's any project that is going to relieve congestion, eliminate congestion in urban areas of big cities. So I don't like that term. When we're discussing these effects, attribute the effect to the cause. We should advocate for more funding for sustainable travel, particularly walking, cycling and public transport. We should argue for more public transport projects because they have better long-term outcomes and shape a more livable city. But let's not promote those projects by peddling a post-truth slogan to support it. As a profession, we should advocate for the right things for the right reasons. Here are a couple of the references that I looked at. Something called the congestion con from America, and a response to that, which is the induced demand con, which both came out in March. So very recent documents, and I don't like either of them. I think both of them are very biased in their point of view. Todd Littman has written a good summary of the issues of generated traffic and induced demand in this document here, which I think is also which is a very good reference. So, any questions or discussion? Danielle, have you been keeping your eye on?
Hi, David. Yep, thank you. There's a lot of good discussion, and people have posted some references and things to watch. I might start with some of the questions first, because there's too many things probably to go through. So Eric asks, if the road network is expanded through building a new road, and if service levels eventually return to pre-project levels, then isn't there an increase in congestion since it is now a larger network?
That's a good question. Look, I think the difficulty there is, how do you define congestion? And I think we as a profession don't really have a very good definition of what congestion is. So there's more traffic because there's some induced demand, and that traffic is experiencing some level of delay, so that's some level of congestion. But the level of congestion from the individual person's point of view is the same as it was before. So that's the way I'd answer that question.
Cool, thanks, David. Lindsay asks, does induced demand also include increased public transport patronage due to PT improvements?
Yeah, I think so. If we improve public transport, you would hope you'd get higher patronage levels. And that's one of my points about induced demand, is that it works just as much for public transport as it does for private transport.
Yep. Abseen asks, would new additional demand due to external shocks, example active transport for exercise during COVID-19, or disruptors like rideshare, new modes, Uber Eats, be included in the second list for what does not constitute as induced demand?
I'm not quite sure I understood that one.
Abseen, feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask your question to David directly.
If you'd like to expand on that one, that would be fine. No takers?
No. Sorry. This is Abseen. I was just asking if the additional trips that people are making, let's say for exercise during the COVID-19 shutdown, or additional trips being made by food delivery services as we go forward without, population increase. Would that be, is that induced demand? Because we have improved, let's say, opening up streets to active transportation and closing them off to vehicles.
I think we should try to restrict the concept of induced demand to when we improve the service levels, how much additional traffic that induces. There are, of course, so many other effects that are happening, and coronavirus is a classic example of a huge change to transport. But they're all changes due to other things. They're not changes as a result of improving the transport infrastructure per se. Any other ones there?
Yep, there's lots. So Catherine asks, how can this help us plan the needed transition to lower carbon transport system?
Hopefully it will help, like having a good understanding of what induced demand is and the effects of that, and taking into account the benefits of traffic rerouting and the efficiency gains that can occur as a result of that, I think is important. So the transition to a low carbon transport system has got to be a multi-pronged attack, and encouraging more active transport, encouraging greater use of public transport has got to be a good thing, and part of that strategy. But to make these decisions, we need to have a good understanding of the concept of induced demand.
Thanks. Another question, is increased traffic a manifestation of increased mobility, and is this a good or a bad thing?
Well, that's from a transport perspective, increased mobility has got to be a good thing and improve the livability of living in a big city. However, if your objective is to reduce carbon emissions, then maybe it's a bad thing. So it depends on your perspective and what you're trying to do.
Yep. Okay, it's 5 o'clock. Maybe we'll have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So does Jevons paradox suggest it's something of a fallacy that network capacity increases can solve the problem of congestion? And if that's the case, then how is it best to reframe the discussion on what is our transport problem?
Yes, so I think how can we reframe? Well, I think our problem is congestion. Not forgetting safety. Safety's got to be important as well, and sustainability. So they're what we're trying to achieve, aren't we? We're trying to achieve a safer transport system, improve mobility, and a sustainable future. So they're the 3 major objectives we're trying to achieve. And what we want to aim for, I think, is more projects that help all 3 of those objectives simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we might go for 1 more question before we close the session. So on the cusp of congestion, the facility is getting maximum use. At that point, the user of the facility makes a decision whether factors such as travel time, delay, lateral clearances, etc. are acceptable or not. Is there a relationship between the acceptance by a road user by purpose and the use of the facility?
Yes, well, it'll certainly depend on their trip purpose. Some trips are more discretionary than other trips. So that will come into the equation. Yep, did I answer that question properly?
I think so. Raj, if you did David answer your question? sort of.
Sort of. Okay, there's a lot of comments there, so it's a bit hard to sort of read through them and see.
Yes. Yeah, there's quite a lot of comments we haven't addressed, but I would just say, David, are people free to continue discussion offline with you if they didn't get their questions answered?
Yes, happy for people to send me emails. trafinity@gmail.com is my email address.
Okay, great. So if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to direct it to David's way. A big thank you to David for his great presentation today, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. There will be a recording available on the ITE ANZ website within a few days, and we'll also make the slides available. We'll also be running a webinar next month, so keep an eye out on LinkedIn and on the ITE ANZ website for further details. We'll also be circulating a questionnaire feedback form in coming days, so if you've got time, let us know how you found this session and any pointers for improvement for future webinars. If people aren't opposed to putting their cameras on for a second, I think we would like to get a photo of everyone. Everyone's still here, so if people wouldn't mind doing that for a minute. I think Rue, you were going to take a photo. He's there still.